Hey folks, it's James, and as teacher of iPad drawing at UCLA, you can imagine I get asked a lot, what's the best app to use for an architect or designer? What's the best app for me? So in my first class, I always teach an overview of the three apps that I use most often: Procreate, Morpholio Trace, and SketchUp for iPad. And this week, it's going to be the intro to Procreate. So grab your iPad, download the original Procreate file made during this video in the description below, and let's look at all the benefits of Procreate for architects and designers like you. So let's start with Procreate, and I probably won't be able to hide my bias. It is definitely my favorite, because when I was struggling to figure out what I basically came to the iPad world as a renderer. So I needed to make renderings right away, and then I only later figured out how to fit it into my design practice. So I guess the way I'd like to couch this is, if you have 0 or even up to number 3 familiarity, let's go through the tools, the minimum tools that you need to understand to really, to slowly become a power user. So I'll go to, join me in launching a screen size canvas. And that just simply means it's literally the size of your iPad. I'm going to go a little off script and have you open up the so-called Actions menu. And you'll hear me call this the wrench menu. I'm fond of that term. And notice over here, let's go to Canvas and tap that. And then at the bottom of, and anybody shout out if you're behind or if I'm going too fast or something. So at the bottom of the Actions menu with the so-called wrench menu, go to Canvas Information. And this shows you the dimensions of this. So in other words, here are these pixels I was telling you about, and this document is now 2732 by 2048 at 132 dpi, and that happens to be the actual specifications of the iPad screen. So that's why that came up, and we'll do some more a deeper dive into some of that later. But for now, let's just assume you want to get going on Monday morning and start using your iPad. So if you have uploaded my Architect's brush set, I'm not sure where it'll be in your menu, but you can comb through your menu this way until you find that. And so the way that I have, and let's see, it's actually activated for me. This is more what yours should look like, okay? So these, I've categorized these in the order of, at the top are sort of what I call architectural symbols, and I suppose interior designers could even use those. And then I have the drafting, or the sort of day-to-day, functional drawing lines of designers, architects and designers. It's sort of like the top drawer. If you had a pencil drawer about 5 years ago that you were still using, all of these are going to be things that might have been in that drawer. So for instance, we already talked about the technical pen. That's going to make a simple line like that. And then I'll tap the brush library icon again. And here's the flat marker. And that's going to be, and notice it'll be very responsive to how deeply you push down, or how hard you push down. And you probably all know this, but if you 2-finger tap, you'll undo the things you did. But if you go too far, you can use 3 fingers. So I'll come back out of this. If we've got the flat marker, and I'll make 3 marks like this. Then I'll 2-finger tap to take 2 of them away, and now I'll 3-finger tap and to bring those back because I went too far. So moving right along, we've got the sort of pens and pencils. We've got the markers. I'll go ahead and undo these, and then we start to get into some interesting things like the chalk thing. So you can sort of, well, that's not the one, I forgot to select it. So I'll select the Bonobo chalk thing. And if you do that and you make that as big as possible, you'll see that it's kind of imitating chalk on a piece of paper. And notice that over here, it builds up more and more each time you go. So that's a particular quality of this brush. But let's undo that with our 2-finger taps. And you can also come over here, by the way, and you can do and undo things with these 2 little arrows over here, everybody. So that's way over here. Okay, and then I'll go back to the brush menu. And then there's some strange things, like you can, if you ever need to quickly make a circle, you can see that I've selected it. And these are unusual, because what you do is you tap right in the middle of the screen. And depending on how hard you tap, if you all test that a little, or if you sort of angle your pencil, regardless of how big this slider is telling you to make a thing, you have this versatility. And if you make the hardest tap possible, it'll never be bigger than that. But what's interesting about this is you can take something like this. The real value of something like this is that you can make a circle that you need, but then you could go to what's called the Move and Transform menu. And we'll skip around a little bit to make this interesting. But up here on this blue arrow is the so-called Move and Transform menu. And you'll see that they have 4 different commands down here. There's a uniform command, meaning whatever you do to this, whether you grab the side the side grips or the corner grips, you will uniformly enlarge or reduce that. And then if you go to freeform, you can change just one parameter at a time. And I don't know if this will work. Yeah, this will work too. So you can make, I'll go back to the big one. You can squish it this way, you can squish it this way, or you can even sort of squinch it that way. And the reason I bring this up is that sometimes when you're sketching, you need to have an ellipse. Let's say that there's a ballroom floor that you're drawing. And if I first flatten it in freeform, and then I expand it, I go back to uniform and expand it, and then I adjust it again, and you can see sort of at some point it's starting to look like an ellipse, and that saved me a lot of time. I didn't have to draw it myself. And then you could, at that point, you could come in above this and add a layer and go back to your, and you don't have to do this with me, but I'm just showing you quickly that you can go back in, and then you might want to like have a person standing there, and I'll change the color of that, so there's a person standing on the ellipse, and before you know it, you've got a pretty good, and then maybe I put a little shadow on that, and suddenly, you're drawing better than you might be able to do freehand. So I'll untap out of that and make all those go away, and I would go back to this. You could stay in black if you want, or pick any color, but I'll go back to red for visibility. And then as we get down, I did skip over the airbrush, which is really one of my favorites, because we're going to do things like gradients and kind of airbrush walls and make the walls change as the light hits them and stuff in the future. So this brush is just fantastic for that. And as an old watercolor artist, or as a previous watercolor artist, that's the kind of thing that I just would have thought was a crime against nature to have an airbrush brush. But once I realized how important it was and how quick it was to do things, I'm totally in love with it now. And so these are, now then you get back to, I call these the kind of man-made texture brushes. And I encourage you to play with all of these. And then if your style is more of a watercolory style, you'll have that as an option as you're filling things in. And I'll give you another quick thing. You can see that this is it's very messy to do this. And it's hard to imagine what that could ever be useful for because it's all over the place and you can't control the edges. But we'll just, in our philosophy here of skipping around a bit, I'll come into the selection tool at the very top, the S here, and I'll tap that. And I'm going to select a rectangle, okay? So down here, you've got your 4 selection modes, and I'm going to go to rectangle. And so everybody play along with me. And I'm going to make just a wall that looks like that, okay? And now I'm going to go, while that's active, I'm going to go back to that, make sure I'm in that wet sponge brush. And there I am. And now I'm going to, let me switch this to a blue or something. Just for fun, I'll switch to a gray blue here. And when you tap your color wheel, you'll probably see something more like this right here, which are the available palettes that you've collected over the years. But you saw where I was actually in here, so I was able to make a quick change of some kind. But again, we'll get into all that. So I'm going to stick with this color that I picked, and I have my wet sponge brush, and I have this rectangle selected. And now I'm just going to sponge into that rectangle, okay? I'll do it once, and I'll lift my pencil again and do it again. And so once that's done to your satisfaction, and you can even add colors to that. You could, let's say that you go and you add a little bit of a sepia color on top, just on one side of it, right? And you get to this point, and you undo the selection button at this point, right? And now, without straining your imagination too much, you can imagine that you've just completed the first wall of a rendering for Mr. and Mrs. Spielberg's beach house. And it could serve as just a two-dimensional elevation. But look, if you look in there, it really looks exactly like, is it Italian plaster, I think? That beautiful finish, that high-end finish that a lot of people use. And then more than that, though, you can now go back to your transform tool, and I'm going to use a freeform transfer mode, or a transform mode here, and I'm going to squeeze this down. And then I'm going to go to distort, and I'm going to squeeze this down, and then squeeze this up, and then move this like this. And you can see now that I've got the first wall, potentially the first wall, in a rendering. And it hardly took any work at all. And what I'll do now is I'll add a layer. So if you've got a shape like that, let's go back to the layer menu and add the plus. And now let's change our color to black, say, or something you would sketch with. I'll use a sort of a pencil gray. And then I'll go back and pick up the what I think is the closest to a pencil, which is the Narinder pencil. And now you could, depending on your skill level, you can start sketching. That's too thick. I'll make it skinnier than that. But you have what sort of, in effect, a guide for the beginning of a perspective sketch, and a quick one, the kind that designers are famous for making on napkins. And so you can complete this like this, and this implies a vanishing point somewhere around here. If you guys are up on the laws of perspective, you know that these are parallel lines in the real world. So wherever they converge is the vanishing point, and also happens to be the horizon. And the reason I bring all that up is because I can now come over to this wall, and as long as my line is sort of headed back to that vanishing point, I can finish out a very quick hand-drawn perspective. And I can even, let's say this is all on one layer so far. Actually, it's 2 layers, I beg your pardon. So there's a trick we can do, and we'll get much better at this over the weeks, but I can, if you go back in, and hopefully you've got 1 layer here for the pencil drawing and 1 layer for the new plaster wall. I can, while that first layer is highlighted, I can swipe right to left on this lower layer, and I take it back. I can swipe left to right on the lower layer. And now they're going to work in tandem, whatever I do. So I can leave that alone. I can go back to this selection, or not the selection, but the move and transform tool. And I can now notice that it's in uniform, and I can begin to scrunch that down, because let's say, typical of a sketch, you begin on the wrong side of the paper, and that's okay. But now with this iPad, though, you don't have to go to the next piece of paper and waste a whole piece of paper, You can now come in here, and now I'll just tap on that pencil layer again. So I'm only drawing on that. I'll make sure that I'm back in that Narinder pencil. I'll touch my brush to make sure I'm still in that Narinder pencil. And now I can just kind of finish that sketch, blah, 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 like that. And before you know it, you've got the beginning of a freehand sketch. I'll show you another quick, wonderful trick, is that if I start this line now, I don't have to come across with a totally freehand line. I can start here, hold the pencil tip down, pull it across, keep the pencil tip down, and that line will snap to straight. It won't be straight across, but it'll be straight in the sense that I can leave it off anywhere I want. So I'll leave it off there. I'll come down here with the same idea, keeping the tip of the pencil down when I get to the bottom, and I'll do it one more time. And there you go. And so just to get this in our muscle memory a bit more, if I now, let's say that I want to isolate each time I do a colored area, I want to make sure it's on its own layer, because another wonderful thing about Procreate, and let's go back into those layers, and I'll go to that colored layer of that color plaster, and I'll switch back to a full view. And so as long as I'm in that layer, I can now come up to what's called the adjustments menu. And don't worry that I'm throwing a lot at you, because all of these, we'll get really good at this in the next 11 weeks. And I can go into hue, saturation, and brightness, which some of you may recognize from Photoshop. And watch what happens with this wall as I change the hue. It'll do all kinds of things. And I can even make it more saturated. So again, to use the analogy of having a job, being lucky enough to have a job for Mr. and Mrs. Spielberg, if they're saying, well, we hate blue, and you're like, okay, well, hold on, how about violet, And so you're starting to save tons of time again with the iPad. And the whole trick there is layers. So just to complete this part of the exercise, let's go back to the layers menu, and notice that whatever I tap gets highlighted. And also whatever I highlight, the next time I tap the plus button to add a new layer, that layer will be added above the highlighted layer. So here I go. I'm going to tap this, and there's layer 3. And you would think layer 3 should be up here, but no, it comes in above what you highlight. And so now I can actually tap anywhere on the screen, or tap back in the layers icon itself. And now with our newfound skill of quickly selecting an area and then filling only that area, I'll go back to the selection tool up here. And this time I will tap freehand. Last time we were in rectangle, but now we've got this trapezoidal shape. So I'm going to tap freehand instead. And now this is going to do point-to-point selection. So I'll tap once there, and let's see if I can make this bigger. I'm not sure I need to. And then I'll tap again here. And it's hard to see, but you can see the marching ants that are starting to happen. I'll tap again here and again here. And the last time I tap, we'll be back on that gray dot, which is right there. And so I'll tap on that, and that whole selection now has been made. So now I can come back in and find a color that I think they'll like, and use that watercolor brush again, but let's use a different brush this time. Let's use that airbrush that I told you about, that I love so much. And so I've selected that, and I'll go back and tap on the screen or tap up here to get back to the drawing. So I'll tap here, and I'll double check the size of the airbrush. That's going to happen when it happens over here on this slider. And the reason you might want the largest possible so that there's no seams to your coloring, which is what I always like to do. So now I'll just add that brown to this, and I'm going to make it smaller so it's more obvious where I'm adding it. So obviously, forgive me, these are the ugly colors, but I'm really just trying to show you how, kind of plant the seed for how quickly you can start making renderings in using these techniques. Okay, so we're still in brushes, and I want to move along a little faster. So let's go ahead and clear, or let's add a new layer on top of all these 3 layers. And actually, what we'll do first is, you remember our little trick about highlighting the top layer, and then come back here, highlighting the top layer, and then doing a left to right swipe to engage the other layers. So I'll do that, and you can engage as many layers as you want in this same action. So now all 3 are working together, and now I can group them like this. And I always have the option of naming the group. All I have to do is sort of tap on the blue, and I can rename it, but I won't worry about that right now. But over here on this little tiny drop down indicator, it's hard to see on the screen, that can close up that group. And now, true to form, when I hit the plus layer sign again, I'm going to be adding a new layer, but it's going to be outside of that group. So this is just a great way, groups is a great way to organize your drawing so you can quickly, in our case, we're going to turn that off so we can keep doing the brush samples, but it'll always be there. And I can always go back inside that group by tapping that drop-down icon, and there's all the elements inside that group. Okay, so I'll turn that group off, and we'll finish up with our brushes. And there's a whole bunch of really fascinating brushes here for making leaves and things. I'm not sure that they were meant for it, but this is some sort of algorithm. And if I choose that, and then I go into, say, one of these greens, and you guys go ahead and pick any color, it really doesn't matter. But I love how, here's the basic idea. I'll make it as big as possible, and you can see the component pieces of this. So I have no idea how this is working, why this is working, but what I often do is I'll take that, and I'm going to make the brush smaller, and I will turn that into the branches of a tree. It's sort of like back here on the East Coast, this might be a maple tree that you've just installed in your yard, so it's not going to be very big. But if you do that also, if you're in that rad brush, and we're doing this together, just make it right about, I guess mine says it's about 17% or 20%, and try and start from the outside, and as you work in, push a little harder, and so that begins to have some of the nature of a tree, in the sense that the leaves as you get out will be a little less, they'll have more light behind them or something like that. And so again, this is not about making a beautiful tree, but it's just about showing you the incredible magic of these brushes. And let's say that you've got the wrong green there, and you hate to undo all your work. You can now come in, because that green is on its own layer, you can now come back to the adjustments menu, and hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll tap that, and once again those 3 classic sliders appear at the bottom, and now I can change that green. And to me, as a former watercolor renderer, and still a person that still loves to watercolor, this has been an absolute game changer to me. I know it was a game changer for me as a watercolor renderer, where literally my livelihood and my success depended on my ability to make renderings that look good, appearing on clients' brochures and on signs in the world and that kind of thing. And I don't know what I would have done without this, because in watercolor you have to get that color right. If not the first time, you've got very little flexibility to alter that color. But here, I can come back to this just to make this example. I'm going to undo the hue, saturation, or the adjustments menu, just so that sits there. And now I'm going to tap the gallery icon so that this drawing goes back into the gallery, okay? And then I'm going to open it up. Imagine this is a week later, and my client finally got around to looking at the rendering, or your interior design client finally got around to looking at their Italian plaster, Venetian plaster, that's the name I'm looking for, their Venetian plaster wall. Well, that is still alive inside the pixels. So as long as I'm in that layer, I can go back to that adjustments menu, tap hue, saturation, and brightness, and this could be a year later or 10 years later, and I can still change that. And that is just a very important thing, especially when you see later when we compare this to Morpholio. So I'll turn that off. I'll go back to the group that we created before. I will open that group with that little drop-down icon, and I'll go back to dreaded wall, and that layer is now highlighted. And I'll go back to the adjustments menu, hue, saturation, and brightness, and that wall is still alive and still active and still available for adjustments. So I know I sound like I hit that point very hard, but I really wanted to get that across to you guys. The last thing I'd like to show you in brushes, I'll go back into this layers menu now. I'll tap the layers icon. And seriously, I think most of these things I learned while I was watching Netflix. So it's really pleasant the idea that you can get better at these things while having fun. You can't beat this. To keep getting better at something while you're having fun at something else is pretty nice, because it's all going in that muscle memory anyway. So let's finish up the brushes by tapping on the layers again, and let's add a new layer. Let's hit that plus button. After you highlight, make sure you highlight the top layer, and then let's hit that plus button again. And let's go back. I'm going to go to the color button and just pick any kind of dark value that you've got ready. I'll go back to the brushes, and we'll make sure we didn't miss anything that's going to come up later. And I guess I'll quickly visit the turpentine brush, because this brush is something strangely, I will use this brush for design. And the reason is that it creates so many accidents. And I love to design and see accidents in things. So if, let's say I was drawing a house in the woods for a new client or something, and I knew it was going to be a low house and have these wings attached to it, not attached to it, but it's going to be a house with wings that go out into the forest. And just by playing with this, I can start to see things like this. This is just an accidental blob, but maybe that's a boulder that's in the courtyard or something. And then I can add more, and I can reduce the opacity over here. And so I bring this up because I think accidents are such an important part of Procreate, or of any digital drawing, really. And they really need to be celebrated rather than embarrassing you or anything. For instance, if there are overhanging limbs in this sketch now, I can almost use this similar to the way we were using the rad brush and start to add foliage in the foreground. So, not to dwell on it, but just the idea that these brushes, definitely use them to create these kind of accidental associations too. And I'll go back, I'll turn that layer off that we just did. I'll add a new layer, and later on we'll be getting into what's called the light brushes, but I'll show you very briefly how that goes. If you go back to your layers now, nothing's turned on ideally, and let's go back to your layers icon, and then down here in the background color, just tap that, and let's say set it at find some dark value. I'm going to go with a cool dark blue gray. Okay, so find something like that, and then now we're back. If you tap here again, we're back in that top layer we just added. Now I'm going to change, and you can see how the background color has changed down here. Now I'm going to change this to white, or some very light color. Okay, and you might want to use a light yellow of some kind. Actually, let's do it together. To go back to 0, we're going to tap the color palette icon. Now we're going to tap disk at the bottom, because you guys may not have all this kind of stuff. So let's tap disk, and then let's go with a very, in terms of the, let's start with a hue, which is the outside ring, and let's go to kind of a warm yellow. Okay, somewhere between yellow and orange, more to the yellow side. And notice that right up here on the left is the color that we're currently mixing up, and on the right is the color that we previously mixed up. So I've got the hue picked. Now I'm going to pick the so-called saturation or the brightness and the darkness. And notice as I move this, this will change up here. Okay, so that's just a helpful way of realizing where you are so far. So I'm going to keep it kind of light and just all the way out to the perimeter, as light as possible in this range. And now I've got that selected, so I'll go ahead and tap the color dot again to make all of this go away. And by the way, I could also just tap on the screen somewhere to make that go away. And now, and this is going to be the last brush thing that we do. Now I'm going to come down here to the light pen. And I think this really should be called the neon sign pen, because now I'm going to just write the word iPad. Or maybe more appropriate would be eat at Joe's. And so this just is such a cool thing in terms of, you never know where this is going to come up. But if you're doing a row of lights under a kitchen counter, or upper kitchen cabinets, you can imagine those. Let's say that this is your drawing of that upper kitchen cabinet, and this is the lower kitchen cabinet, just to save time. And your client says, "Well, what will the lighting be like?" And you go, "Well, there's going to be under cabinet lighting like that," and then you can see that it just creates this beautiful glow. So there's all kinds of unanticipated ways that you're going to use these brushes. But I'll just quickly go through. There's the light pen, which is, again, this is all the way at the bottom of this architect's brush set. And then the light brush is just a bigger version of that, but with more of a brushy thing, almost like a Marvel Comics kind of thing. And again, depending on how hard you push down, will be a different effect. And then while we're in that dark color, we'll finish up and we'll go to these, what they're called bokeh lights, which create that effect that you see in photographs at night. And I'll use this a lot for, I forget what it's called, but festoon lights for patios and things. Let's go back to one important thing now, which is drawing to scale in Procreate, before we move on to Morpholio, because a lot of people aren't aware that you can draw to scale in Procreate. So I'm going to go back to this background color, and I'm going to undo that dark one that we did, and I'm going to pick just a white one. And if you don't have any whites in your palette, let's say that you're over here and you don't have any whites, just come to that disk. Come to that disk and just move the inner dot to total white. And now the background color reflects that, okay? So I had you download those grids and things earlier. So the way that you draw to scale, and we're going to go all the way back to the gallery first, everybody. So let's go back to the gallery. And what I do is, if you go all the way back to the gallery, when I'm drawing in scale, the key to drawing in scale in Procreate is for everything to be at the scale of the grids and the rulers that I shared with you guys. So I will sort of have a routine where instead of going to the plus button automatically to start a new job, which is up here, I'll go to the import button, then I'll go to my iCloud Drive, and then I'll go down to, but here we go. So here's my grids, and I'm going to go with 17 by 11 grid, because I figure that's the most useful thing if you're going to be printing things out for a client. Let's say that you're doing all this work and you're going to rush off to a coffee shop or a bar and present your work to a client. It's always nice to have the option to just quickly print things out at 17 by 11. I think it makes it a little more alive for them rather than presenting things on your iPad. So this whole draw to scale ecosystem that I've created is predicated on these set sizes that are easy to print. So I'm going to go into my grids, Imperial 17 by 11, and I'll launch this one, this 17 by 11 1/8 inch with emphasis. It's sort of a cryptic way of saying it, but it means the size is 17 by 11, the scale is 1/8, and there's an emphasis every 1 inch. And I'll go ahead and launch that. And again, don't worry if you don't have that yet. We'll get that. We'll make sure that we'll get that later. And so you can see, and I hope it shows up, but even shrunk down to the size of my iPad screen, but still at 300 DPI, right? So when this prints, it's going to have plenty of resolution. But at the moment, and I don't know if you all know that trick where you obviously pinch and zoom works on the iPad, but you can also do a quick sort of a collapsing pinch to get back to full size, at least in Procreate. So the funny thing is, you remember it's 17 by 11 with an emphasis at 1 inch. And if you count these, we won't do it, but there are 17 of these bigger squares across and 11 this way. And then the next thing that you're going to do is import, and I should mention that if that grid is too strong for you, and I don't like a very strong grid, you can come into the layers, there's that grid, and you can tap the what's called the blending mode button, and you can just scale back that opacity. And it's sort of like going to Staples and finding the best sketchbook for your, your style or whatever. So I can go all the way back to 0 and make it kind of light. But I want to keep it dark enough that you all can see. And I'll do that 2-finger pinch again to go all the way back. Tap out of the layers. And now the next thing to do is to go back to your actions menu, the wrench menu. And now you're going to add on top of that grid, you're going to add insert a file. And you're going to go back to that iCloud drive. And now you're going to look for the scale rulers. And sometimes I've forgotten where I put them. If you guys see, shout out. But I'll go to this, what I call the half scale rulers. And I'll go to the Architect's half scale. It's a 2-sided ruler with 1/8 scale on one side and 1/4 on the other. And there it comes. And it's already activated to be moved around, and you can do that. But what you want to do is avoid touching it, because you don't want to change the scale, and I'll show you why. It's already, and I'm going to go ahead and tap the move and transform icon, so I'm no longer at risk of moving it. But now if I enlarge it, you can see, and I'll tap the move and transform again, just to bring it back over. So I've got that 0 on this emphasized line, and sure enough, each of those tiny little squares is 1 foot. So I'm now officially in a 1/8 inch equals a foot ecosystem, which, because this is a pixel-based program and not a vector-based program, there's nothing to be gained or lost by using either Procreate or Morpholio for what we're calling concept design. And so because what you export is always just going to be a JPEG, and you'll see later that when we get the introduction to SketchUp for iPad, all we're going to be doing is bringing in JPEG drawings and then stretching them out and starting to build on top of them. So in terms of like which app should I use, so far Procreate and Morpholio are on the same page when it comes to scale. So there's one more twist to this. Now again, I call this the 300 DPI draw to scale ecosystem for a reason. And so now if we go back to the wrench menu, and by the way, my highest praise for all of you that you're all following this. I haven't heard a peep out of any of you. So I apparently have the brightest students at UCLA this semester, and I'm very grateful for that. So I'm going to go back to the wrench menu. I'm back to insert a file, and here's where all these toys come into play that we uploaded before. And now I'm going to go to my FF&E, which of course is especially important for all of you. And I'm going to go to this FF&E Imperial, just because we're working in the Imperial scale system. And it's got 1/8. And I'll tap on that. And I guess that gave me a couple of options. And I can see, I'm going to go with the bigger one that's still 17 by 11. I've also got these smaller 3300 square ones. But I'm going to go with the bigger one that's at 17 by 11. I'll tap on that. In it comes. And this is, now make sure to tap your selection, or rather your move and transform icon, because they always come in hot. They always come in live. And I'll tap that icon, so now it's all safe. And let's enlarge this and just look at what's going on. So these are what I call placeholder FF&E, and I've tried to create a representative bunch and organize them by kind of, activity, seating, group seating, pianos, got to have those, offices and desks, dining room, that stuff. But the key point to be made here is, let's look at the layers, and we can see now we've got the 1, 2, 3 punch, the grid on the bottom, the scale ruler, and then this FF&E as just one example of things you can do. And as long as that FF&E layer is highlighted, I'll come up here now and touch the move and transform icon. And there's no danger, because we're so closed in, there's no danger that I'm going to change the scale by accident, but I can just start moving this around. And the reason I wanted to move it is because you're all more skilled at interior design than I am. And I'm going to untap that. And you know the size of things by heart. Now I'll go back to the scale and tap that, because I want to move that over so it's in the context of these pieces of furniture. And so not only can you count these things up on the grid, but you can also see now that true to form, that lounge chair there is, or that club, I guess you'd call that a club chair, right? It's about 3 to 3.5, 3'4". So it's very good for placeholder purposes. And all of that is because they're all working in tandem together. Okay. Now there's one very important thing I want to stress to you, which is, and this is a drawback of Procreate, but I work around it. And that is that because I took this FF&E template over to the side to make a point about how big these things were, Procreate doesn't allow anything to go beyond the border of the drawing. So I have effectively cut off that template by demonstrating the way I did to you, but I can get around that. I'm just going to use those 2-finger taps again, And I'm going to undo these actions and bring it all back. Because the way that you really use these is you want to make sure you're in that FF&E template layer. And the way that I've designed these is that you can use the rectangular selection tool on any of these. You can use freehand also, but you can use rectangular selection on any of these and just quickly grab them. And then at the bottom of the Procreate of this selection tool menu, you'll see something called copy and paste. And I'm going to tap that with this selected. I'm going to tap that. And it doesn't look like anything's happened. But if I go into the layers menu now, and join me as we do, there that item is on its own layer, okay? And now I can turn off the sort of placeholder layer, the layer that has everything. That goes away, and the thing that I selected and copied and pasted stays there. And now I'm safe, so to speak. I can move that. I can go back to the Move and Transform menu and move that anywhere I want to. And if you're so inclined, you can also, let's say that it's not exactly the right size for you, so you can still use these items to reduce the size. You can modify it so it's exactly that 3'2" by 7'1" ellipse that your client wants to use. And there's one more point I want to make before we adjourn for the introductory Procreate session. There's one more really interesting thing about these stencils, and you won't find the same thing with Morpholio. And by the way, I'm not trying to sell you anything because I've given all of you all these things already, so this is my pleasure to do this. But I just love to make the point that Procreate is a more of an open source program in a way. It's used by more people, far more people, a vastly larger user base, because it includes artists as well. So I can come into this, as long as I'm in that layer, I can come into this stencil and I can choose a color. I'm gonna choose kind of a wood color, okay? And I'm up here, let's choose a light oak color or something like that, okay? And I'll tap out, and there it is selected. I can literally, a couple ways to do this, but I can tap and hold on this dot, and then it takes a little practice, but I can drag it over and release it into that table. And the reason that happens is because this is a finite object on its own layer, and anything I drag a color onto in a finite object will then take on that color. So you can notice how it's only selecting the part that is bounded by that black line. So I'd have to come back in again and fill it into that color. So this is just a terrific shortcut for adding these colors. So I'm showing you that because that's only one way to do it. And this introductory session is meant to dazzle you and not necessarily for you to remember what you're seeing, but you will be remembered by the dazzlingness of this program. I can also come in here and tap on this layer and select the layer. So let's do that again. We're going to go into the layers menu. We see that if it's not already selected, go ahead and select that table. And now tap the blue bar again, and that opens up the layer drop-down menu. And I'm going to select this entire object. And so you can see when we talk about a finite bounded object, everywhere that you see the marching ants is just a void as far as Procreate is concerned. And this object is on its own at our behest, any way we want to manipulate it. So what I can do now is go back in. I've already selected it once, so I've been in that menu one time to hit select. Now I'm going to go back in and hit fill, and it's going to fill it with that color. So this is another way to quickly do renderings. Now notice the black lines went away. So you may or may not want that situation. Let's undo it with 2 fingers. And I'll show you another amazing thing about this program, is that I've got this thing selected. So without wasting any additional effort, I can now add a layer. And this time I can just do the color fill up above the black and white object, which is going to give me more flexibility. So I'm going to tap, the selection is already mapped out. The marching ants are busy at work. And all I've really done is added a new layer above this. And now I'm going to hit fill again, okay? Now the difference is, once again, all the black lines went away. But those of you that know Photoshop will know that all I have to do now is tap the blending mode, and I can drag up here to multiply. And as you know from Photoshop, anything in multiply mode will let anything darker underneath it show through. So now I've got the best of both worlds. I've got my black and white drawing. I've got a color that I think the client will like, but
I can change that color. I can come back in here in hue, saturation, and brightness, change the color, desaturate. Maybe it's a more of a marble or something, with a light, God knows what, very light finish. And then I'm way overdoing this with you guys right now, but because it's on its own layer, I can say, oh, you know what? I messed up. They actually want chairs a different color. So I can select one of these erasers. So here we have the brushes. The smudge tool is next, and the eraser tool is here. And whatever brush is showing in the brush library is normally the brush that shows up, or rather the brush library set that shows up in the eraser. And so I can just use either the airbrush, or I like to use this flat marker because it's like a flat white eraser. And I can adjust the size of that eraser here, and I can just scrub out only the color of the chairs. And if we look at that, you can see it's kind of hard to see, but I'll see if I can pull it. You can see that as I erase these, those chairs disappear one at a time. And now it's got just 3 colored chairs around it. So this is the power of layers and drawing to scale and color working together. And you can see it makes a very compelling case for why Procreate is the so-called rendering program, but also has this ability to draw to scale as well.
To go deeper into any of the techniques or benefits you saw in this video, check out the courses I offer in the description below. To see the next video in this series, click on this video here, and I will see you in the next video.